just led them to believe that I was planning on raping them, you know.
But did you tell them?
Yeah, I told them that. That was the only way I could think of to get them out of the car. They just flat out refused to get out of the car. So I warned them. I said, look, get out of it. I'm going to have to shoot you right here.
How many times did you have to say that?
Well, I said it, 2 or 3 times, and that's to let them know that I was serious. I could have just said, hey, look, I'm a serial killer.
He was a sniper, carrying his rifle in scope and guitar cases. In St. Louis, he staked out a synagogue and gunned down Gerald Gordon. In Madison, Wisconsin, a young interracial couple. In Salt Lake City, Franklin killed 2 young black men who were jogging with white female friends. Even civil rights leader Vernon Jordan and Larry Flynt, infamous pornographer, founder and publisher of Hustler magazine, shot with Franklin's sniper rifle, but survived. So you hunted him down?
Yeah, I was hunting him down. Yeah, I ain't gonna deny that.
The single, unwavering drive in Joseph Paul Franklin, murder.
Just go out and kill somebody at random. I would never do that.
14-year-old Darrell Lane and his 13-year-old cousin Dante Evans were killed at random as they walked along Reading Road to a corner grocery store June 8, 1980. Franklin admits he was in the Cincinnati area the day before the murders, but he won't admit to the murders. Police still work on the case to this day, and they still think Franklin did it, but there isn't enough evidence to prove it.
He hates men. He would never talk to you. He said, but if you have a pretty assistant prosecutor, and I brought in Missy Powers.
I think men took the approach, if you send in a pretty face, they're going to confess. But I was hoping that you needed more than just that.
Franklin agreed to meet with Powers, but there were ground rules. No video, only a tape recorder, and no meeting on Hitler's birthday.
My name is Melissa Powers. I'm an assistant prosecutor here with Joseph Franklin. We're here to talk about the Cincinnati case.
Melissa Powers is brought in to talk with Franklin in the hopes that maybe they will catch him off guard. For narcissistic offenders and psychopathic individuals, the idea of having an attractive young woman come in to talk to him would have given him the sense that he was in a position of power and authority, and maybe a willingness, hopefully, to actually talk and share more about crimes he had done.
What can you tell me about that, Joseph?
Well, I did it. The only thing I can say is I did do it.
And can you also tell me why you did it?
I was trying to get rid of all the ugly people in the world.
So here we have Franklin, who's been silent for 17 years about these crimes. And within minutes of talking to this female prosecutor, he starts to just unload everything, saying, I did it. I wanted to get rid of all the ugly people in the world. The clear connection between racism and psychopathy is inherent grandiosity and narcissism. He really seems to think he has a special purpose. This is his way of saying, I am white and therefore better than you. But it also has a little bit of attention-seeking beat.
What brought you to Cincinnati, Ohio back in June of 1980?
Well, one night I wanted to sell a rifle, and route I went to Johnstown, Pennsylvania. That's where I committed another sniper and killed an interracial couple there.
Okay, let me take you back. Let's talk about Cincinnati.
June was the most prolific. I was most prolific as far as murders go in that month. I committed 6 murders. Prior to that, I robbed a bank, 2.
Franklin's desire to talk about what he wanted to talk about, not only was his narcissism at play, but his need to maintain control of the interview. Franklin decided that he needed to pump up his notoriety. Crimes are no good for a narcissist if you don't get credit for them. Look at how many of these crimes I've committed and never got caught for, and how many people I killed. And he says it with pride. The fact that he uses the word prolific, he's putting himself in a position of authority. He's not bothered by what he's done. He's getting a high off of it.
I was just getting very upset because the news media, the national media, wasn't covering what I was doing. They were pretty well suppressing the news. I just decided to just turn up the heat a little bit, just start committing more killings, just to try to force them to give me publicity. They finally began to connect the Vernon, Georgia shooting, the Cincinnati shooting, and then shortly afterward I committed the Utah killings. That was good, you know. So I decided to just keep it up.
Very few things are as dangerous as a psychopath that feels rejected. It infuriates them. The only way he has to respond is taking all the anger and frustration that he's feeling and essentially kill more people specifically so he would get more publicity. He wanted the coverage and the grandiosity of being able to be the person on the news, even though it was for a horrible thing. But he was known and people were talking about him.
Was there any planning involved in the murder that you committed in Cincinnati?
Other than just going over my escape route. Yeah. I had to stay down. It seemed like I had to sit there for at least an hour or two. But finally I heard somebody yelling and looked down there and saw a couple of dudes coming down the sidewalk, you know. I just put the gun right on the biggest dude first, and I fired one shot with that 44 Magnum. The other guy, as soon as he heard that shot, he just bolted and started running. I aimed the gun, just hoping I would get a lucky shot. It was just like through a miracle that I got him, man. I aimed the gun and hit him, you know. And sure enough, it actually got him.
He's talking about these two child victims as adults. He's depersonalizing them by talking about them as dudes. And the fact that he's referring to it as a lucky shot, it's also dehumanizing them. He's talking about them like they're target practice. It's not that they're someone's children, somebody's brother. It is a lack of caring about human life and compassion, but the predatory component is also thrill-seeking.
Did you, I know in other ones that you told me about, you shoot the second one and you go back and shoot the first one.
Yeah.
Did you do anything like that in this one?
I believe I did shoot the first one again, because after Larry Flint shooting, I just became very upset about killing Larry Flint. And now I regret actually even shooting it. It was really a tragedy. Just wanted to kill him really bad. I just considered if it was just one hour, I was a complete failure.
Larry Flint published in Hustler magazine a man and a woman that were interracial together. So because Larry Flint did something that Franklin essentially disagreed with, he thought he should die for it. In his mind, he failed. He called it a tragedy, but not because Larry Flint was wounded and paralyzed forever, but because he didn't kill him.
That's the thing about sniping. I never can tell where the shots are coming from, where you're at. So that's one reason it's so easy to get away with that type of murder.
But tell me about how long were you waiting? Or did you have...
I had the area staked out. You know, I would usually just stake an area out, just like Johnstown, Pennsylvania.
Right.
The Rainbow killings were a little different in Mobile because I just picked him up hitchhiking, something I had not planned, you know. maybe an hour or so's drive into West Virginia and saw them hitchhiking and decided to, pull over and go ride. I got into a conversation with the one in the back seat regarding interracial dating and all this. And she advised me that she had dated blacks. So at that point, I decided to waste both of them and lure them out to the woods.
In his mind, these girls did something wrong. He wanted to kill that day, and no matter what they said, he was going to do it. But the MO is different, which shows that he's probably escalating in what he needed to achieve the same level of power and control, to get the same level of gratification from these crimes. Sniping isn't a very intimate experience. There's a distance. You don't really get to see the expression on the face as the people are dying. But killing somebody point blank, especially if they're begging for their lives, that's really when he feels the most power over somebody else's life and really has that grandiosity that he's so desiring.
It was a very isolated area, nobody around at all. I ordered them out of the car. They refused to do it.
Were you showing anger at that point?
Oh, no, I wasn't showing anger, no. You don't want to go around being angry because then you'll mess up things. I just led them to believe that I was planning on raping them,
Did you tell them?
Yeah, I told them that. That was the only way I could think of to get them out of the car. I didn't want to tell them I was going to kill them.
He's really going through basic problem-solving strategies without any consideration for human emotions, for the fear these women must have felt. You see this total depersonalization of the victims. And when Franklin recounts what he did to these victims and how he terrorized them emotionally in those moments leading up to their death, he's callous about it.
They just flat out refused to get out of the car. So I warned them, I said, look, get out of it. I'm going to have to shoot you right here. I could have just said, hey, look, I'm a serial killer. I will kill you if you don't get out.
Did they show any fear?
No, they didn't seem to, When I realized they weren't going to move, I just went ahead and shot the one immediately right there in the front seat,
And where did you shoot her?
Right in the chest. After I shot her, I pointed the gun in the back seat toward the other one and shot her in the head.
He had self-monikered himself as a serial killer, basically saying, well, I just wasted them before I really told them the thing that would have very much scared them. But he's just writing this off as a loss. He got the kill, but that really wasn't what he was after. He wanted the response, and he was almost disappointed when they didn't show that fear.
Franklin really seems to like to stay in control of his victims, like many psychopaths, because it feeds into the idea that they are important and that they are superior. In this situation, when he encountered resistance of any kind, he just shot them to death.
Did you get any emotional satisfaction or anything out of killing either one of those girls or both of the girls?
It's not that you get emotional satisfaction. It's somebody you think should be wasted, So I just went ahead and wasted them.
Okay.
It's not something that really turned me dead, just to get turned on or anything. To me, it was just, something I had to do. It's a nasty job, but somebody had to do it. I'd enjoy doing it.
Were you traumatized by it?
Not by that time, no. First one did. After that, I kind of got used to it. Anyway, I don't recall any sort of feelings I had at the time about shooting them. I just wanted to, get rid of them. That was it.
He's saying it didn't upset me, it didn't traumatize me, because he was just doing his job. He was doing that unsavory task that needed to get done, even if it's not pleasant. That's consistent with a psychopathic individual who doesn't have normal connections to other human beings. This is a very predatory individual who gets his sense of self-confidence and station in life from deciding who lives and who dies. But there's a little bit of euphoria you hear in his voice. There's a chuckle. He is glib about how he's describing the crime, and that arousal does speak to some energy or adrenaline that he was experiencing both at the time of the crime as well as now recounting it for this interviewer.
Why did you decide to confess?
Well, I had a dream that told me to confess to this.
It's a few weeks away from Franklin's execution, and he's doing this media tour, accepting all kinds of interviews from reporters, both locally and nationally. He really wants to make sure that he is well known to the world about what he did. Franklin gets his pleasure from notoriety. Not the actual act of killing, but being known as someone who does that. He's not saying, I regret what I did. I regret the harm that I put on these victims and their families. It's all about him.
Joseph, you've been on death row now for what, 16 years?
Yeah, about 16 years.
And now the execution date is drawing very near. What are your feelings with that deadline?
Well, I'm hoping to get a stay of execution. I would love to be out on the streets right now.
You realize you were wrong about everything you did?
About every single crime, every law that I broke. It was wrong. From robbing banks to carrying out murders. I've, repented of my sins, asked the Lord for forgiveness.
It's not uncommon for psychopaths to sort of shift their identity and play off of what works in the moment. And at that moment, the thing that was going to work best for him was, I'm repenting, I see the light, I believe in God, and I'm asking God for forgiveness. Whether he believes any of that is completely disputable. He wants clemency, and he's trying to do anything he can to still play the fiddle and see what makes people dance. I guarantee you, if you asked him 2 days later and he didn't get what he wanted, he would take it all back.
I wanted to start a race war. That was my motivation.
When did you first get the urge to kill?
You're the first person that's ever asked me that question. When I was little, my mother used to make me and my brother stay inside all the time. Me and my brother, Gord, could not go out and play ball with other boys, socialize. I think that stunted our mental development. He went crazy, actually crazy. One night I dreamed that I had killed my mother, I was told that I was guilty of matricide, murdering your mother. Mm-hmm. And so after thinking about it for a while, the dream was basically telling me that all the crimes that I committed during that 3-year period I was committing those crimes, I was basically striking back at my mother. That was my way. It symbolizes me getting back at my mother, killing her for what she done to me. You hear me?
While there's no doubt that early childhood trauma, emotional neglect, abuse are not optimal ways for a child to be raised, Franklin is attributing a lot of his formation of hatred and racist attitudes and being a dysfunctional, antisocial human being and psychopathic. He's blaming all of it on that. Franklin is doing nothing other than shifting the blame and minimizing the seriousness of what he's done. And ultimately, that lack of willingness to take true responsibility for his own attitudes and choices and behaviors speaks to the skin surface level of remorse and regret he had even up until his dying days.
Most people out there, they're heading toward a burning hell and they don't know it.
Do you think something lies for you on the other side after November 20th?
Yeah, but it isn't a burning hell, though, because I'm a servant of the Lord, though.
in which the evidence seems to point toward a single answer. There are cases in which a body is found, a weapon is recovered, a confession is recorded, and a jury is eventually able to reconstruct what happened. And then there are cases like Larry Dwayne Hall. Hall was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment in connection with the kidnapping of 15-year-old Jessica Roach. Yet he was never convicted of murdering her. At the same time, investigators came to suspect that Hall might have been connected to a much wider series of disappearances and deaths involving young women across the American Midwest. Some of those suspicions were accompanied by confessions. Some were followed by retractions. Others never developed into charges at all. And that distinction is essential, because the story of Larry Hall is not simply the story of a convicted criminal. It is the story of a man whose name became attached to a collection of unresolved cases, and of investigators who could never be certain how much of what he said was truth. The central mystery surrounding Hall can be reduced to a deceptively simple question. When a man confesses to a crime and later says that what he described was only a dream, what exactly are investigators supposed to believe? Larry Dwayne Hall was born in 1962 in Wabash, Indiana. As an adult, he worked ordinary jobs and, on the surface, lived a relatively unremarkable life. But one interest would eventually become significant to investigators. Hall was deeply involved in Civil War reenactments. He traveled throughout the Midwest to participate in these historical events, sometimes appearing in places far from his home. On its own, there was nothing suspicious about that. Civil War reenactment was a legitimate hobby, and traveling to participate in it provided an entirely ordinary explanation for Hall's presence in different towns and communities. But investigators later noticed that some disappearances occurred around areas and periods in which Hall had also been traveling for these events. That did not prove that Hall had committed those crimes, but it gave him something investigators could not ignore: a legitimate reason to move extensively through a region where numerous young women disappeared. In the early 1990s, Hall also came to the attention of authorities because of reports involving young women in a van. Several girls in the Georgetown area reported being followed or approached by a man in a van. A group of them remembered the vehicle's license plate. That plate eventually led investigators to Larry Hall. By 1994, police had stopped Hall in Gas City, Indiana, and searched his van. Inside, they found a knife, rope, a mask, a container of starting fluid, and a notice concerning the disappearance of Tricia Reitler. Reitler was 19 years old when she disappeared from Indiana Wesleyan University in March 1993. She had gone from the university to a nearby supermarket and never returned. Her clothing was later found near the school, with signs of blood. Hall became an important suspect in the investigation, and investigators found items in his vehicle that they considered relevant to the case, including a map, ether, photographs, and material concerning Reitler's disappearance. Hall would later reportedly confess to involvement in Reitler's case, and then retract that confession. Her body was never found, and Hall was never prosecuted for her disappearance. That pattern would become one of the defining features of his story, a disturbing allegation, sometimes accompanied by a confession, followed by uncertainty. But before investigators could fully understand what Hall might have known about Reitler or other missing women, another case brought him into sharper focus. Her name was Jessica Lynn Roach. Jessica was 15 years old. On September 20th, 1993, she left her home in Georgetown, Illinois, riding a new bicycle. At approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, she was still seen riding near her home. About half an hour later, her sister discovered Jessica's bicycle. Jessica herself was gone. There was no ransom call. There was no indication in the available information that Jessica had intended to leave home. Her family reported her disappearance, and a search began. But the search initially produced no answer. For Jessica's family, the absence was the most terrifying kind of uncertainty. There was no explanation for where she had gone, no clear indication of what had happened, and no immediate evidence showing who might have taken her. Nearly 6 weeks passed. Then, on November 8, 1993, Jessica's body was found in a cornfield near Perrysville, Indiana. The discovery placed her across the state line from the Illinois community where she had disappeared. By then, the body had undergone significant decomposition and had also been damaged by agricultural machinery. Investigators faced an immediate problem. They could not determine the cause of death with certainty. The location where Jessica had disappeared also yielded little physical evidence capable of explaining what had happened to her. There was a missing 15-year-old girl, a body found in another state, and a growing absence of answers. The investigation, therefore, depended heavily on finding a person who could connect those 2 points. Reports involving the man in the van provided one possible path. Witnesses had remembered the vehicle's license plate, and that information led investigators to Hall. Slowly, the case began to shift. Hall was no longer simply a man who traveled extensively across the Midwest. He was a man whose vehicle had been noticed by young women in the area, a man whose van contained objects investigators found troubling, and a man whose name had already surfaced in connection with another missing young woman. Yet none of those circumstances, individually or collectively, established that Hall had murdered Jessica. The crucial evidence would eventually come from Hall himself. In November 1994, FBI investigators became involved in questioning him. According to the supplied case information, on November 15th, Hall's interrogation began at approximately 10:00 in the morning and continued until around 3:20 the following morning. An FBI agent, Randolph, prepared Hall for a polygraph examination, but Hall refused. Randolph then questioned him privately for approximately 2 hours. Eventually, the conversation turned toward Jessica Roach. Hall began talking about her. Approximately 20 to 30 minutes later, he began acknowledging involvement in her disappearance. By the end of the interrogation, Hall signed a written statement in which he admitted kidnapping Jessica and killing her. On paper, it was the kind of development investigators had been waiting for. But the confession carried a serious complication. The crucial interrogation had not been audio recorded or video recorded. Instead, the FBI agent documented Hall's statements in written form, and Hall signed the resulting statement. That detail would later become central to the legal battle over the reliability of the confession. Hall eventually withdrew it. He said that what he had described was not a memory of an actual killing, but a dream. His defense would argue that Hall possessed psychological characteristics that could make him susceptible to suggestion and strongly motivated to satisfy the expectations of an interrogator. The question was no longer simply whether Hall had confessed. He had. The question was whether the confession represented a truthful account of a crime, a false confession, or something more complicated. That uncertainty would follow Hall into court, and it would eventually produce one of the strangest legal outcomes in the case. A man could be convicted of kidnapping Jessica Roach and sentenced to life in prison, while the question of whether he actually murdered her remained outside the certainty required for a murder conviction. For the investigators who believed Hall might know more than he admitted, Jessica's case would become only the beginning. For her family, however, it remained something more fundamental. The story of a 15-year-old girl who left home on a bicycle one September afternoon and never came back. And behind every later suspicion surrounding Larry Hall, that fact would remain unchanged. Before Larry Hall became the central figure in one of the Midwest's most disturbing unsolved investigations, he was not a man whose name appeared in national headlines. He was born in 1962 in Wabash, Indiana, and as an adult he worked ordinary jobs, including laboring and janitorial work. There was no obvious public identity that marked him as someone capable of becoming the focus of a federal investigation. What would eventually make Hall significant was not a single dramatic event in his early life, but a combination of circumstances that, when examined years later, began to look increasingly troubling. One of the most important was his fascination with Civil War reenactments. Hall regularly traveled to different parts of the Midwest to participate in these historical events. He would take on the appearance and role of a Civil War soldier, immersing himself in a hobby that required travel and could bring participants together in towns far from where they lived. In itself, there was nothing criminal about that interest. Thousands of people participated in historical reenactments, and there was nothing inherently suspicious about driving across state lines to attend one. But Hall's hobby gave him something investigators would later regard as important: a legitimate explanation for why he might be somewhere far from Wabash. If Hall was seen in another community, his presence could be explained by an upcoming or recently completed reenactment. In a period before smartphones, GPS tracking, widespread surveillance cameras, and the extensive digital records that investigators can rely upon today, reconstructing the movements of a person could be extraordinarily difficult. Hall could travel long distances without generating the kind of electronic trail that would now be almost unavoidable. That does not mean his reenactment activities were evidence of criminal behavior. They were not. But once his name became associated with missing women, investigators began examining his movements more closely and asking whether some of those trips had placed him near locations connected with disappearances. The question was not simply where Hall lived. It was where he could go and how easily he could explain being there. During the early 1990s, another part of Hall's behavior began attracting attention. Young women in the Georgetown area reported encounters with a man driving a van. Some described being followed or approached. These reports were significant because several girls were able to remember the vehicle's license plate. That information eventually gave investigators something concrete to work with, rather than searching for an unknown person with only a vague description. They had a vehicle and a registration number that could potentially lead them to its owner. That trail led to Larry Hall. By this point, Hall was beginning to occupy an uncomfortable space in the investigation. He was not simply a traveler who happened to visit places where young women disappeared. He was a man whose vehicle had reportedly been noticed by young women in the area, and his name would soon become connected to more than one missing person investigation. One of the most important cases was that of Tricia Reitler. Tricia was 19 years old and a student at Indiana Wesleyan University. In March 1993, she left the university and walked toward a nearby supermarket to buy something. She never returned. The disappearance was deeply troubling because there was no explanation for where she had gone. Her clothing was later found in an area near the school, with signs of blood. Hall eventually became an important suspect in the investigation. According to the supplied case information, investigators found several items in his vehicle that they considered relevant, including a map, ether, photographs, and newspaper material concerning Reitler's disappearance. Hall would later reportedly confess to involvement in Reitler's case, only to withdraw the confession. Her body was never found. Hall was not prosecuted for her disappearance. That distinction matters because the existence of suspicious circumstances does not establish criminal responsibility. The same principle would become increasingly important as Hall's name appeared in other investigations. A missing person could become associated with Hall because he had been in the area, because someone remembered his vehicle because he made a statement, or because investigators found something they considered suspicious. None of those circumstances, by itself, established that Hall was responsible for a disappearance or murder. Yet the accumulation of these connections was enough to keep investigators looking at him. Another case that would later attract attention was the disappearance of Linda Weldy. Linda was only 10 years old when she disappeared in La Porte, Indiana, on February 24, 1987, after getting off a school bus. Approximately 3 weeks later, her body was found in a remote area several miles from where she had disappeared. Her death was determined to have resulted from manual strangulation. Hall was considered as a possible suspect because he had been in the area around the relevant period, but there was no prosecution of him for Linda's death. Again, the distinction between suspicion and proof is critical. Linda Weldy's case remains a tragedy in its own right, regardless of whether Hall was ultimately responsible. Her family lost a child, And the fact that Hall's name entered the investigation does not transform an unresolved case into a solved one. Then there was Wendy Felton, a 16-year-old who disappeared from Marion, Indiana, in 1987. When her sister returned home, Wendy was no longer there, while personal belongings remained in her room. Her disappearance occurred in an area relatively close to Wabash, Hall's home region, and near places associated with his travels for historical reenactments. Hall was considered a suspect, but Wendy was never found, and Hall was never convicted in connection with her disappearance. As investigators examined these cases, the same problem continued to appear. Hall could sometimes be placed in the general area. He could travel extensively. His van had attracted reports from young women. He had been associated with more than one missing person investigation, and, in some cases, he would later make statements claiming responsibility. But the physical evidence needed to transform suspicion into a criminal conviction was often absent. This was particularly significant in cases where no body had been recovered. Without a body, investigators might lack a confirmed cause of death. Without a confirmed cause of death, establishing that a disappearance had become a homicide could itself be difficult. And without physical evidence connecting a suspect to the victim, a confession could become the central piece of the case. Hall's own statements, therefore, became increasingly important. But they also became increasingly difficult to interpret. He sometimes confessed and later withdrew what he had said. He could describe an alleged crime and later characterize the account as a dream. That pattern would eventually cause investigators and lawyers to confront an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps Hall knew things because he had committed crimes, but perhaps some of his statements were fabrications. The two possibilities could even coexist. A person could tell the truth about one crime and lie about another. A confession could contain accurate information mixed with invented details. And without independent evidence, investigators could not simply assume that every statement Hall made was reliable. This uncertainty would become the defining feature of his reputation. To some investigators, Hall appeared to be a man whose movements and behavior deserved intense scrutiny. To others involved in the legal process, the problem was more precise. Suspicion had to be separated from evidence. A list of missing women was not a list of proven victims. A confession was not automatically proof of murder. And a suspicious object inside a vehicle was not necessarily evidence that the object had been used in a crime. Still, by the time Jessica Roach disappeared in September 1993, investigators had already encountered Hall's name in a troubling context. There were reports involving his van. There were earlier missing person investigations in which he had been considered. There was his extensive travel throughout the Midwest. And there was an emerging pattern that would soon place him at the center of a much more serious investigation. Jessica's disappearance would bring all of those threads together. A 15-year-old girl had vanished while riding her bicycle near her home in Georgetown, Illinois. Within weeks, her body would be found across the state line in Indiana. And the man whose vehicle had already attracted the attention of young women in the area would eventually become the subject of an interrogation that lasted through the night. But before that interrogation, investigators still had to answer the most basic question: who had taken Jessica Roach, and how could they prove it? On September 20th, 1993, Jessica Lynn Roach left her home in Georgetown, Illinois, riding a new bicycle. She was 15 years old. It was an ordinary activity, the kind of brief trip that should have carried no sense of danger. At approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, Jessica was still seen riding near her home. Nothing in the available information suggests that she intended to disappear, that she had arranged to meet someone, or that she had planned to leave her family. Then, within roughly half an hour, everything changed. Jessica's sister discovered her bicycle lying on the road. The bicycle was there. Jessica was not. There was no immediate explanation for what had happened between the moment she was seen riding and the moment her bicycle was found. There was no ransom call. There was no known message explaining her absence. There was simply an empty road and a 15-year-old girl who had vanished. For her family, the uncertainty would have been devastating. But for investigators, the first hours and days of a disappearance are also a race against time. Every hour that passes can mean another piece of evidence disappears. Another witness forgets what they saw, and another possible route becomes impossible to reconstruct. In Jessica's case, the initial search did not immediately produce the answer everyone wanted. There was no clear physical evidence establishing where she had been taken or who had taken her. Her bicycle provided an important starting point, but it could not explain what had happened to its owner. The investigation, therefore, had to move outward from the place where Jessica was last known to be. Investigators had to consider who might have encountered her, what vehicles had been in the area, and whether anyone had reported suspicious behavior involving young girls. At this stage, Larry Hall was not yet the established answer to the case. He was one possible name among the leads that would gradually emerge. The reports involving a man in a van would eventually become important because several young women in the Georgetown area had reported being followed or approached. Some of the girls remembered the vehicle's license plate. That detail mattered enormously. A vague description of a stranger could lead nowhere, but a license plate could potentially identify the person behind the wheel. The information eventually led investigators to Hall. Yet even then, the connection remained circumstantial. Hall had a van. Young women had reported encounters involving a van. His vehicle could be identified through the remembered license plate. But none of those facts, standing alone, established that he had abducted Jessica. Investigators still needed evidence that could connect Hall directly to what had happened to the 15-year-old. The search for Jessica continued. Nearly 6 weeks passed before the case took its most painful turn. On November 8, 1993, Jessica's body was discovered in a cornfield near Perrysville, Indiana. The location was significant because it was across the state line from Georgetown, Illinois, where Jessica had disappeared. What had begun as a missing person investigation had now become a death investigation. But even that did not provide investigators with all the answers they needed. Jessica's body had been badly decomposed. It had also been damaged by agricultural machinery. The condition of the remains made it difficult for investigators to establish exactly how she had died. The cause of death could not be determined with certainty. That single problem would have enormous consequences. A body had been found, but the physical evidence could not provide a simple explanation of the circumstances surrounding Jessica's death. Investigators could not confidently reconstruct where she had been killed. They could not establish with certainty what had happened to her after she disappeared. And they had little physical evidence capable of creating a direct link between her death and a particular suspect. The case therefore remained dependent on circumstantial evidence and investigative leads. This is where the difference between suspicion and proof becomes especially important. A person can appear suspicious without being legally responsible for a crime. A vehicle can be associated with a disappearance without proving that its owner committed an abduction. A suspect can have troubling objects in a vehicle without those objects establishing how a victim died. Investigators still have to build a chain of evidence strong enough to withstand scrutiny. In Jessica's case, the emerging connection to Hall was built gradually. Reports from young women about a man in a van provided one piece. The remembered license plate provided another. Hall's presence in the broader region provided another. His previous appearance in investigations involving missing young women added further reason to examine him. But the investigators still needed something more direct. Hall's vehicle would become particularly important. In 1994, police stopped Hall in Gas City, Indiana, and searched the van. They found a knife, rope, a mask, a container of starting fluid, and a notice concerning the disappearance of Tricia Reitler. Each item had a potentially disturbing significance in the context of the investigation, but it was important not to treat the presence of those objects as proof that they had been used in a crime. The discovery increased investigators' interest in Hall. It did not, by itself, solve Jessica's case. The same was true of the material associated with Tricia Reitler. Reitler had disappeared in 1993, and Hall had become a suspect in that investigation. Investigators found material in his vehicle that they regarded as relevant to her disappearance. Hall later reportedly confessed to involvement in Reitler's case, then withdrew the confession. Tricia's body was never found, and Hall was never prosecuted for her disappearance. This was precisely the kind of uncertainty that surrounded the wider investigation into Hall. Investigators had reason to look at him, but they could not automatically convert every suspicious circumstance into a proven crime. Jessica's case would ultimately become different because Hall himself would make statements concerning her. But before that happened, the investigation had to confront the difficulty created by the physical evidence. Jessica's body had been found, yet her exact cause of death remained uncertain. Her disappearance began in Illinois, while her body was discovered in Indiana. The two locations had to be connected. Investigators needed to understand how she had traveled from one place to the other, who had transported her, and where the fatal events had actually occurred. Without those answers, even a confession could become vulnerable to challenge. This would become particularly important later, because Hall's eventual confession was not accompanied by a recording of the interrogation. The investigators would have to rely on a written account of what Hall said, and Hall would later claim that his statements described dreams rather than actual memories. But in the autumn of 1993, none of that was known yet. Jessica's family was still facing the immediate reality of losing a 15-year-old daughter. The discovery of her body ended one kind of uncertainty, but it created another. They now knew Jessica was dead, but they did not have a complete explanation for how she had died or who was responsible. For investigators, the case had become a search for a chain of evidence. For the people who loved Jessica, the issue was more fundamental. A young girl had left home on a bicycle, and she had never returned. Her bicycle had been found within minutes of the last known sighting. Nearly 6 weeks later, her body had been discovered in a cornfield across the state line. Somewhere between those two moments lay the answer. And as investigators began examining the reports involving Larry Hall and his van, the case slowly moved toward a confrontation that would eventually determine the course of his life. Hall would be questioned. He would talk. He would eventually sign a statement saying that he had kidnapped Jessica and killed her. But before the confession came the investigation, the reports, the vehicle, the missing girl, the recovered body, and the unanswered question that remained at the center of everything. What had actually happened to Jessica Roach between the last moment anyone saw her and the moment her remains were found in Indiana? By the time investigators began focusing more closely on Larry Hall, the case of Jessica Roach had already become a difficult investigation with few straightforward answers. Jessica had disappeared in Georgetown, Illinois, while riding her bicycle. Nearly 6 weeks later, her body had been discovered in a cornfield near Perrysville, Indiana. The distance between those two places was not enormous, but the state line created another layer of complexity. Investigators had to determine not only who had taken Jessica, but how she had been transported and where the events leading to her death had occurred. At the same time, reports from young women in the Georgetown area were beginning to provide investigators with another possible path. Several girls reported encounters involving a man driving a van. Some described being followed or approached. These reports might have remained isolated incidents if not for one important detail. A group of girls had managed to remember the vehicle's license plate. That number gave investigators something tangible. Instead of searching for an unidentified stranger based only on descriptions, they could trace the vehicle itself. The license plate eventually led them to Larry Hall. Hall was not a stranger to the region. He lived in Wabash, Indiana, and his interest in Civil War reenactments regularly took him to different communities throughout the Midwest. His movements were therefore difficult to interpret. There were legitimate reasons for him to be in many different places, and his presence in a particular town did not automatically establish criminal activity. But now investigators had a more specific reason to examine him. His van had been noticed by young women, and his vehicle could be connected to reports of suspicious behavior. That made Hall a person investigators needed to understand. What they did not yet have was a direct physical connection between Hall and Jessica Roach. The investigation therefore developed through accumulation rather than through one decisive piece of evidence. Hall's name had already appeared in the broader landscape of missing person cases, including the disappearance of Tricia Reitler. Reitler, 19 years old and a student at Indiana Wesleyan University, had disappeared in March 1993 after walking from the university toward a nearby supermarket. She never returned. Her clothing was later found near the school, with signs of blood. Hall eventually became a significant suspect in the case. Investigators also found material in his vehicle that they considered relevant, including a map, ether, photographs, and newspaper material concerning Reitler's disappearance. Hall later reportedly confessed to involvement in Reitler's case, then withdrew that confession. Her body was never found, and Hall was never prosecuted for her disappearance. This was important to investigators because it demonstrated that Hall's name had surfaced in another case involving a missing young woman before the Jessica investigation reached its later stages. But it was equally important from a legal perspective because suspicion was not the same as proof. Hall's connection to Reitler remained unproven. The same caution applied to the reports involving his van. A vehicle being reported by young women did not establish that Hall had abducted anyone. The contents of the vehicle were troubling in context, but the supplied evidence does not establish that any of those objects were used against Jessica or another victim. Investigators needed stronger evidence, and in 1994, they obtained an opportunity to examine Hall more closely. Police stopped him in Gas City, Indiana, and searched his van. Inside, they found a knife, rope, a mask, a container of starting fluid, and a notice concerning Tricia Reitler's disappearance. The collection of objects immediately raised questions. A knife and rope could have ordinary uses. A mask could have ordinary uses. Starting fluid could also have ordinary uses. But investigators were not looking at the objects in isolation. They were looking at them inside the vehicle of a man who had already attracted attention because of reports involving young women in a van, and whose name had appeared in connection with another missing woman. Context made the discovery more troubling, even though it still did not provide a direct forensic link to Jessica. This distinction is essential when reconstructing the Hall investigation. In a true crime story, individual details can become powerful because they appear to fit together. A license plate, a missing girl, a body found across a state line, a suspect who traveled widely, objects found inside his vehicle, another missing woman whose disappearance had also attracted his name. But investigators and courts cannot simply treat a collection of suspicious circumstances as if it were a single piece of conclusive evidence. Each connection has to be examined on its own terms. That would become particularly important because Hall's later statements would become the most significant evidence against him. Before the FBI interrogation, investigators had already spent months trying to understand the relationship between Hall and Jessica's disappearance. The van reports gave them a reason to look at him. The license plate gave them a way to identify him. The search of his vehicle produced material investigators found troubling. His earlier association with other missing person investigations added context. But none of those developments answered the fundamental question: had Hall actually taken Jessica? The investigation had reached the point where suspicion alone was no longer enough. Investigators needed Hall to explain his movements and his connection to the case. In November 1994, the investigation moved into a new phase when the FBI became involved in questioning him. According to the supplied case information, the crucial interrogation took place on November 15th. It would last for hours, continuing well into the following morning. The length of the questioning would later become significant because of the circumstances under which Hall eventually confessed. But before that confession, investigators had to establish a relationship with a suspect who had already shown that his story could be difficult to interpret. Hall was prepared for a polygraph examination by FBI agent Randolph, but he refused to take it. The investigators then continued questioning him. Randolph eventually questioned Hall privately for approximately 2 hours. At some point, the discussion shifted toward Jessica Roach. This was the moment the investigation had been moving toward since Jessica disappeared more than a year earlier. Hall began to talk about her. According to the supplied information, approximately 20 to 30 minutes later, he began acknowledging involvement in her disappearance. Eventually, he signed a written statement admitting that he had kidnapped Jessica and killed her. For investigators, this was a dramatic breakthrough. A suspect was no longer simply being connected to a missing girl through circumstantial evidence. He had now signed a statement acknowledging responsibility. But even at that moment, there was a complication that would later become central to the legal case. The interrogation had not been audio recorded or video recorded. There was no complete recording that a jury could later hear and examine for itself. Instead, the FBI agent documented Hall's statements in writing, and Hall signed the resulting statement. That meant the precise circumstances surrounding the confession would later become a matter of dispute. What exactly had Hall said? How had the conversation developed? How much had come from Hall spontaneously, and how much had emerged through questioning? And what did Hall actually mean when he described what had happened to Jessica? These questions became even more important when Hall later withdrew his confession. He claimed that the events he had described were dreams rather than memories of a real killing. His defense would argue that Hall had psychological characteristics that could make him particularly vulnerable during interrogation and inclined to satisfy the expectations of the person questioning him. The prosecution, however, had the signed statement and the surrounding investigative circumstances. The disagreement over the confession would eventually become one of the most important legal issues in the case. But before the courtroom battles began, investigators had already reached a significant turning point. Larry Hall was no longer simply a name connected to suspicious reports. He had become the man who had signed a statement admitting that he kidnapped Jessica Roach and killed her. Yet there was still a profound difference between admitting to a killing and proving a murder beyond the legal standard required for conviction. Jessica's body had been found, but the cause of death could not be established with certainty. The exact location where she had been killed remained unclear. The physical evidence directly connecting Hall to her death remained limited, and Hall himself would soon deny the meaning of the confession he had signed. The case had therefore reached a strange crossroads. Investigators believed they had finally found the person who could explain what happened to Jessica. But the very statement that appeared to provide that explanation would soon become the subject of one of the most complicated false confession disputes in the case. The next stage would move the story from the roads and fields of Illinois and Indiana into the courtroom, where the question would no longer be simply whether Larry Hall seemed suspicious. It would be whether the evidence, including his controversial confession, was sufficient to establish his legal responsibility for Jessica Roach's kidnapping. What did Larry Hall actually tell the FBI? The investigation into Jessica Roach had spent more than a year moving through uncertainty. Jessica had disappeared in September 1993. Her body had been discovered almost 6 weeks later in a cornfield near Perrysville, Indiana. Investigators had connected Larry Hall to reports involving a van and young women, and they had already examined his possible connection to other missing person cases. But none of those developments had answered the central question with the certainty required in a criminal case. What had happened to Jessica, and what role, if any, had Hall played? Then came November 15th, 1994. According to the supplied case information, the interrogation began at approximately 10:00 in the morning and continued until around 3:20 the following morning. More than 17 hours had passed by the time the questioning ended. The length of the interrogation would later become important because Hall's defense argued that his psychological characteristics and the circumstances of questioning could make his statements unreliable. At the beginning of this critical sequence, FBI agent Randolph prepared Hall to take a polygraph examination. Hall refused. The refusal did not end the investigation. Instead, Randolph continued questioning him and eventually spoke with him privately for approximately 2 hours. At some point, the conversation turned toward Jessica Roach. This was the moment investigators had been working toward. Hall began discussing Jessica. According to the supplied information, approximately 20 to 30 minutes after the discussion shifted to her, Hall began acknowledging involvement in her disappearance. Eventually, Hall signed a written statement. In that statement, he admitted that he had kidnapped Jessica and killed her. On the surface, the confession appeared to provide the breakthrough the investigation needed. Until that point, investigators had been forced to construct a case from circumstances, reports involving Hall's van, the remembered license plate, his previous appearance in investigations involving missing young women, and objects discovered in his vehicle. Now they had something apparently direct. Hall himself had signed a statement acknowledging responsibility for Jessica's abduction and death. Yet the confession immediately contained a weakness that would later become one of the defining issues of the entire case. The interrogation had not been recorded. There was no audio or video recording that could later allow a jury to hear Hall's exact words, examine the sequence of questions, or independently evaluate his tone and responses. Instead, the FBI agent wrote out a narrative of Hall's statements, and Hall signed it. That meant the legal system would eventually have to evaluate not only what the written statement said, but how reliable the process behind it had been. The distinction mattered. A confession can appear powerful because it comes directly from the accused person. But the circumstances under which a confession is obtained can affect how much weight a court or jury should give it. In Hall's case, the defense would later argue that he had characteristics that made him vulnerable to suggestion and strongly motivated to satisfy the person questioning him. They argued that this could make him capable of confessing falsely. Hall himself eventually provided the strongest argument for that position when he withdrew the confession. He said that what he had described was not a real memory of killing Jessica. He said that it had been a dream. That claim created an extraordinary contradiction. Hall had signed a statement admitting that he kidnapped Jessica and killed her. Later, he said the account was not a confession to a real crime at all. It was a description of something he had dreamed. Investigators were therefore faced with two incompatible versions of the same event. One version came from the written statement. Hall had kidnapped Jessica and killed her. The other came from Hall's later explanation. He had described a dream, not an actual killing. The question for the legal system was whether the confession was reliable enough to be used against him. The question for investigators was even more difficult. If Hall was lying when he withdrew the confession, why was he doing so? But if Hall was telling the truth when he said it had been a dream, why had he signed a written statement accepting responsibility? Those questions could not be answered simply by pointing to the existence of the signed document. They required an examination of Hall's psychological characteristics, the interrogation itself, and the reliability of confessions. The defense sought to present expert evidence concerning false confessions. Their argument was not necessarily that every statement Hall made should automatically be believed. Instead, the issue was whether there were recognized psychological factors that could make his particular confession unreliable. This became especially important because the prosecution did not have the kind of physical evidence that could independently resolve every uncertainty surrounding Jessica's death. Investigators knew that Jessica had disappeared. They knew that her body had later been found. But the supplied information emphasizes that the cause of death could not be established with certainty because the remains had decomposed and had been damaged by agricultural machinery. Investigators also could not establish with certainty where Jessica had been killed. These limitations meant that Hall's statement became particularly important to the prosecution's case. The defense therefore had a strong reason to challenge the reliability of that statement. The legal battle that followed would not simply concern whether Hall had signed the confession. It would concern whether the jury should be permitted to hear expert testimony about the possibility of a false confession. At the first trial, Hall was convicted of kidnapping Jessica with the purpose of serving a sexual objective and transporting her from Illinois to Indiana. He received a sentence of life imprisonment. Importantly, the conviction did not establish that Hall had been legally proven to have murdered Jessica. The federal charge concerned kidnapping, and the available evidence did not allow prosecutors to secure a murder conviction. That distinction is sometimes lost when the case is summarized, but it is central to understanding what the court actually established. Hall had been convicted of kidnapping Jessica Roach. He had not been convicted of her murder. His confession said he had killed her, but the legal conviction did not transform that statement into a murder conviction. The case then entered another phase when Hall appealed. In 1996, the United States Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit overturned the first conviction and ordered a new trial. The appellate court did not declare Hall innocent. Instead, the issue involved the treatment of expert evidence concerning false confessions. The trial court had not allowed the defense to present that evidence fully before excluding it, and the appellate court held that the question needed to be considered under the standards associated with Federal Rule of Evidence 702 and the Daubert framework. This was an important distinction. The appellate ruling did not say that Hall's confession was false. It did not establish that Hall had not kidnapped Jessica. It said, in effect, that the defense needed a proper opportunity to address the scientific and psychological question surrounding false confessions. Hall would therefore receive another trial. The case that had begun with a missing 15-year-old girl and a bicycle left on a road had now become a broader legal dispute over memory, confession, interrogation, and the reliability of testimony. The retrial would force the prosecution to defend its case again, while the defense would have another opportunity to challenge the confession that had become so central to the government's theory. For Hall, the stakes were enormous. For Jessica's family, the legal process represented another attempt to establish responsibility for what had happened to her. And for investigators, the case remained frustratingly incomplete. Even if Hall was convicted of kidnapping, the fundamental unanswered questions would remain. Where exactly had Jessica been killed? What had happened between the moment she disappeared and the moment her body was found? And most importantly, was Hall telling the truth when he signed the confession, or when he later called it a dream? The answers would not come easily. The first conviction had been overturned, but the government's case had not disappeared. Hall would face another jury, and once again, the central piece of the prosecution's case would be the statement that he himself had tried to explain away. When Larry Hall's first trial ended with a conviction, the legal process appeared to have reached a conclusion. Hall had been found guilty of kidnapping Jessica Roach, a 15-year-old girl who had disappeared while riding her bicycle in Georgetown, Illinois, and whose body was later discovered in a cornfield near Perrysville, Indiana. He received a sentence of life imprisonment. Yet the conviction did not erase the uncertainty surrounding the case. Hall had not been convicted of murdering Jessica. The prosecution had established his responsibility for kidnapping her, but the circumstances surrounding her death remained much less certain. Most importantly, the confession that had become central to the government's case was already under attack. Hall had signed a statement saying that he had kidnapped and killed Jessica. Later, he withdrew that confession and said that what he had described was a dream. The defense argued that the confession could be unreliable, and the legal battle eventually moved beyond the question of what Hall had said to the more complicated question of whether a jury should be allowed to hear expert testimony explaining how false confessions can occur. In 1996, the United States Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit overturned Hall's first conviction and ordered a new trial. The ruling did not mean that the appellate court had determined Hall was innocent. It did not establish that the confession was false. Instead, the court focused on the treatment of expert evidence concerning false confessions. The defense had attempted to present expert testimony about the psychological mechanisms that can contribute to false confessions, but the trial court had not permitted that evidence to be fully considered before excluding it. The appellate court concluded that the issue needed to be evaluated under the standards governing expert testimony, including Federal Rule of Evidence 702 and the principles associated with Daubert. That distinction is important because the appeal was not simply a dispute over whether Hall had committed the crime. It was a dispute over whether the jury had been given an adequate opportunity to understand the reliability of the confession on which the prosecution relied. The defense position was straightforward in principle. Hall had a history of making statements that he later withdrew. In the Jessica case, he had signed a written confession after an extraordinarily long interrogation. The questioning began at approximately 10:00 in the morning on November 15, 1994, and continued until approximately 3:20 the following morning. Hall had refused a polygraph examination, and FBI agent Randolph later questioned him privately for approximately 2 hours. Eventually, the discussion turned toward Jessica, and Hall began acknowledging involvement. He ultimately signed the written statement, but there was no audio or video recording of the interrogation. That meant the jury could not independently hear the entire sequence of questioning. Instead, the case relied on the written account prepared by the FBI agent and signed by Hall. The defense, therefore, wanted the jury to understand that a confession was not automatically reliable, simply because it had been signed by the person accused. Hall's lawyers argued that his psychological characteristics could have made him particularly susceptible to suggestion and eager to satisfy the expectations of the person questioning him. In that interpretation, Hall's confession could have been sincere in the moment without being factually true. This was the essence of the false confession argument. It was not necessary to claim that Hall had never spoken about Jessica. He clearly had. The issue was whether his statements represented memories of actual events or whether psychological factors in the interrogation process had contributed to an untrue confession. Hall himself had supplied the basis for that argument when he later said the events he described were dreams. For the prosecution, however, the existence of a signed confession remained powerful. Hall had not merely been accused by someone else. He had put his own name beneath a statement acknowledging that he had kidnapped Jessica and killed her. The government could also point to the broader circumstances that had brought Hall under suspicion. Young women had reported encounters involving a man in a van. A license plate connected the vehicle to Hall. His van contained objects investigators regarded as troubling, including a knife, rope, a mask, starting fluid, and material concerning Tricia Reitler's disappearance. Hall had already been examined in connection with other missing person cases, and Jessica's body had eventually been found in Indiana, across the state line from the place where she disappeared. Yet none of those facts independently establish murder. That limitation remained throughout the case. The physical condition of Jessica's remains prevented investigators from determining the cause of death with certainty. Agricultural machinery had damaged the remains, and investigators could not establish precisely where she had been killed. The absence of a clearly established cause and location of death made the prosecution's reliance on Hall's statements especially important. The legal question, therefore, became whether the confession, combined with the other evidence, was sufficient to sustain a kidnapping conviction. After the appellate court ordered a new trial, Hall was tried again. The second proceeding did not end in an acquittal. The jury once again found Hall guilty. He again received a sentence of life imprisonment. The retrial, therefore, produced an important outcome. The first conviction had been overturned, but the government's case survived the challenge. The legal system had given the defense another opportunity to challenge the evidence, including the controversy surrounding false confessions, and a second jury nevertheless reached a guilty verdict. The story did not end there. In 1999, the Seventh Circuit considered the case again and upheld the result of the retrial. Hall therefore remained in prison for life. By this point, the legal distinction surrounding his case had become clear. Hall was a convicted kidnapper in the Jessica Roach case. The conviction had survived appellate review, but the legal record did not establish a murder conviction against him. That distinction is essential because the wider mythology surrounding Hall often becomes larger than what was actually proven in court. His name became connected to numerous disappearances and suspected murders across the Midwest. He had reportedly confessed to other cases and later withdrawn some of those statements. Investigators believed he might know far more than he had admitted. But the courtroom had not established that every missing woman whose case intersected with Hall's movements was his victim. The retrial also changed the meaning of the confession itself. It was no longer enough to say simply Hall confessed. The more accurate statement was that Hall signed a written confession, later retracted it, described it as a dream, and nevertheless was convicted of kidnapping after a second trial. The legal system ultimately accepted the evidence as sufficient for that conviction. But the unresolved questions surrounding the confession remained. If Hall had truly abducted Jessica, what exactly had happened after he took her? Where was she killed? Why could investigators not establish the precise location? And why had Hall later insisted that his account was only a dream? Those questions became even more important as investigators began considering whether Jessica's case represented only one part of Hall's activities. His name continued to surface in other investigations involving missing women and girls. Some cases contained suspicious circumstances. Some involved Hall's alleged confessions. Some included possible connections through his travel throughout the Midwest. But none could simply be added to the Jessica case and treated as equally proven. The law had drawn a boundary around what could be established. Beyond that boundary lay a much larger and darker field of uncertainty. Hall was serving life in prison, but investigators continued to wonder what he might know about other disappearances. The most significant attempt to answer that question would come later. After Hall was already incarcerated, investigators would eventually turn to another prisoner, James "Jimmy" Keene, and ask him to do something that conventional interrogation had not accomplished: get close to Hall, earn his confidence, and determine whether Hall would reveal information about other killings. The objective would not simply be to obtain another confession. Investigators needed something more valuable, information that could be independently verified. If Hall could identify a victim, describe a location, and lead investigators to physical evidence, then his words could potentially be tested against reality. Without that independent confirmation, another confession could become just another statement from a man whose history had already demonstrated how difficult it was to separate truth from invention. That was the next stage of the Larry Hall investigation. The man already serving a life sentence for kidnapping Jessica Roach might know the answers to other disappearances. But to find out, investigators would have to enter an entirely different world: prison, deception, and a carefully constructed relationship between two inmates. And at the center of that operation would be one persistent question: was Larry Hall finally going to tell the truth? The conviction of Larry Hall did not end the questions surrounding him. It established one important fact in the eyes of the law. Hall was guilty of kidnapping Jessica Roach and would spend the rest of his life in prison. But the conviction did not explain the many other disappearances that had drawn investigators' attention over the years. Hall had been considered in connection with several cases involving young women and girls. In some instances, he had reportedly confessed and then withdrawn his statements. In others, there was no body, no definitive physical evidence, and no prosecution. The result was an unusual situation. Investigators had a man serving life in prison who might know much more than had been established in court. But they could not simply assume that every story he told was true. Hall's history of changing his accounts made that problem particularly serious. If he claimed responsibility for another disappearance, investigators needed a way to determine whether he was describing a real crime or creating another story. They needed information that could be checked against independent evidence. This was the reason the investigation eventually turned toward another prisoner, James Jimmy Keene. In 1998, Keene was serving a 10-year sentence for drug-related offenses. According to the supplied information, federal prosecutors approached him with an extraordinary proposition. Keene would be transferred to the federal facility in Springfield, Missouri, where Hall was being held. His assignment was not to confront Hall as an investigator. He was not supposed to announce that he was gathering evidence. Instead, he would approach Hall as another prisoner and gradually build a relationship with him. The objective was to persuade Hall to talk about the crimes he might have committed. But even that description does not fully explain what investigators wanted. They did not merely want another confession. They wanted a confession that could lead somewhere. If Hall said that he had killed a particular woman, investigators needed more than the words themselves. They wanted information about where the victim might have been taken, where a body might have been buried, or details that only someone genuinely connected to the crime would reasonably know. The difference was crucial. Hall had already demonstrated that he could confess and then retract what he had said. Another unverified confession might add little to what investigators already knew. A specific location or physical piece of evidence could change everything. Keene therefore entered the situation with a difficult task. He had to gain Hall's trust without allowing Hall to understand the true purpose of their relationship. The investigation depended on patience. Hall was not simply another suspect waiting to be questioned. He was a man who had already learned that talking could have consequences. He had been interrogated by authorities, had signed a confession, had withdrawn it, and had ultimately been convicted. Inside prison, he might have had his own reasons for deciding what to reveal and what to conceal. Keene would have to find a way to make Hall comfortable enough to talk. As their relationship developed, Hall began discussing women and alleged killings. According to Keene's later account, Hall made statements suggesting involvement in multiple cases. But the same problem that had followed Hall throughout the earlier investigation returned almost immediately. Could he be believed? Hall could provide a detailed story and later deny it. He could describe an event and then claim that it had been a dream. He could change details, including locations or the identities of people involved. This created a strange psychological landscape in which even an apparent confession could not be accepted at face value. Keene had to listen for information that could be tested. He was not simply trying to make Hall talk. He was trying to determine whether Hall knew things that an uninvolved person would not know. That distinction became the foundation of the operation. One of the most striking elements described in the supplied material was a map that Hall allegedly created or possessed. Keene reported seeing a map of the Midwest marked with numerous red dots. The map was associated with areas including Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. Hall also made wooden hawks. When Keene asked about the birds, Hall reportedly said they were watching over the dead. The imagery was disturbing, but the significance of the map was far less certain. Keene suspected that the red dots represented places where Hall had buried victims. Yet there was no established official record proving that every red dot corresponded to a grave. The map became part of the mythology surrounding Hall, but it could not simply be treated as a confirmed inventory of murder sites. This is where the difference between investigative suspicion and established fact becomes particularly important. A map with red dots may be evidence of something. It may be a representation of real locations. It may also have a personal or psychological meaning unrelated to actual crimes. Without independent verification, the meaning cannot be established with certainty. The same principle applied to Hall's conversations with Keene. Hall's statements were potentially important because they came from a man already convicted of kidnapping Jessica and suspected of involvement in other disappearances. But his credibility was complicated by the very behavior that made him an object of fascination to investigators. He had a documented pattern of confession and retraction. He had previously said that his account of Jessica's death was a dream. That meant Keene could not simply accept every news story. He had to distinguish between information that might be meaningful and information that might be invented. This uncertainty became the central challenge of the prison operation. Investigators believed Hall might be responsible for additional crimes, but they needed something that could survive scrutiny. A statement such as, "I killed another woman," could be denied later. A statement that identified a specific location, explained a sequence of events, or led investigators to physical evidence would be much more significant. The ultimate goal was therefore not confession for confession's sake. It was verification. The operation also reflected the limitations of the earlier investigation. Hall's movements across the Midwest had made it difficult to reconstruct where he had been. His Civil War reenactment activities gave him legitimate reasons to travel to many locations. The missing person cases were scattered across different communities and sometimes different states. Many of the cases lacked bodies or decisive physical evidence. In the era when these disappearances occurred, investigators did not have the same technological tools that would be available decades later. There were no comprehensive mobile phone location records placing Hall near every relevant site. There was no modern surveillance network capable of documenting his movements. There was no universal DNA database capable of instantly comparing evidence from one crime scene with another. As a result, investigators were forced to rely heavily on witness reports, physical evidence that happened to survive, records of travel, and statements from suspects or witnesses. Hall's imprisonment changed the circumstances, but did not solve the evidentiary problem. He could no longer move freely around the Midwest, but he could still possess information. If he truly knew where victims had been buried, he might be able to provide information that investigators had never been able to obtain. Keene's role was therefore unusual. He was not simply gathering gossip from another prisoner. He was attempting to determine whether Hall could lead investigators toward answers that had remained inaccessible for years. At the same time, Keene himself had to navigate a relationship based on deception. Hall believed he was speaking to another inmate, not an investigator acting indirectly on behalf of the authorities. That dynamic created another layer of uncertainty. Anything Hall said would have to be examined carefully because his motivations were unknown. Was he telling Keene the truth because he wanted to confess? Was he trying to impress another prisoner? Was he manipulating Keene? Was he testing how much Keene believed? Or was he mixing truth with fantasy? The investigation could not assume the answer. This was the paradox at the center of Larry Hall's story. His words were potentially the key to understanding cases that had remained unsolved, but his words were also among the least reliable pieces of evidence available. The investigators therefore needed patience and skepticism in equal measure. Keene continued building the relationship. Hall continued talking. The stories became more disturbing, and the possibility emerged that Hall might know information about multiple missing women. Yet each statement created another question rather than closing the investigation. If Hall named a victim, could investigators identify her? If he described a burial site, could they find physical evidence? If he drew a location on a map, could that location be independently connected to a disappearance? Only those answers could transform a prison conversation into evidence. And so the investigation entered its most uncertain phase. Larry Hall was already a convicted criminal, but the possibility remained that he had information about crimes for which no one had ever been held responsible. James Keene was now positioned close enough to hear what Hall might reveal. The question was whether Hall would eventually provide something more valuable than another. Confession, something that could be tested against the physical world. Because if the stories could not be verified, they would remain exactly what Hall had given investigators before: words, disturbing and sometimes detailed, but impossible to separate completely from the possibility of invention. By the time Larry Hall was serving his life sentence, the case against him had already established one fact beyond the uncertainty that surrounded so many other allegations. He had been convicted of kidnapping Jessica Roach. But the investigation into Hall had never been limited to Jessica. Long before the prison conversations with James "Jimmy" Keene, investigators had encountered Hall's name in connection with other missing women and girls across the Midwest. Some of those cases involved circumstances that appeared troubling. Some involved alleged confessions, Some involve Hall's presence in the relevant area. Others remained mysteries with no body, no definitive forensic connection, and no criminal charge against Hall. Together, however, these cases created the possibility that Jessica Roach might not have been an isolated incident. That possibility was one of the reasons investigators continued to examine Hall even after his conviction. The difficulty was determining where suspicion ended and evidence began. One of the most significant names was Tricia Reitler. Tricia was 19 years old and a student at Indiana Wesleyan University. In March 1993, she left the university and walked toward a nearby supermarket to buy something. She never returned. Her clothing was later discovered in an area near the school, and the available information indicates that there were signs of blood. The disappearance was deeply concerning, but investigators did not have a body that could provide a definitive account of what had happened. Hall eventually became an important suspect. Material discovered in his vehicle was considered relevant to the investigation, including a map, ether, photographs, and newspaper material concerning Reitler's disappearance. Hall also reportedly confessed to involvement in Reitler's case. But then, as had happened elsewhere, he withdrew the confession. The case never resulted in a prosecution of Hall, and Tricia's body was never found. Her disappearance, therefore, remained separate from the conviction involving Jessica. The distinction is essential. Hall's connection to Reitler was suspicious enough to attract investigators' attention, but it was never established in court that he had abducted or killed her. Another case that drew attention was that of Linda Weldy. Linda was only 10 years old when she disappeared in La Porte, Indiana, on February 24, 1987, after getting off a school bus. Approximately 3 weeks later, her body was found in a remote area several miles from where she had disappeared. Her death was attributed to strangulation by hand. Hall was considered a suspect because he had been in the area around the relevant period, but the investigation did not result in a criminal charge against him. Linda's case illustrates the challenge investigators faced when examining Hall's possible involvement in older crimes. His presence in a particular location could be significant, especially when combined with other circumstances, but it was not enough by itself to establish responsibility. Another name associated with the investigation was Wendy Felton. Wendy was 16 when she disappeared from Marion, Indiana, in 1987. When her sister returned home, Wendy was gone. Her personal belongings remained in her room. The disappearance occurred relatively close to Wabash, where Hall lived, and near an area associated with Hall's Civil War reenactment activities. Investigators considered Hall as a possible suspect, but Wendy was never found and Hall was never convicted in connection with her disappearance. Again, the pattern was the same: an unresolved disappearance, circumstances that brought Hall into investigators' attention, and no definitive legal conclusion connecting him to the crime. The case of Lori DePies created another complicated connection. Lori disappeared in 1992, and Hall was later reported to have confessed to James Keene that he was involved in her disappearance. But once again, the problem was verification. Hall's statements could not automatically be treated as factual simply because he presented them as confessions. His history made investigators cautious. He had confessed in the Jessica case and then said that his account was a dream. He had reportedly confessed to involvement in Reitler's disappearance and later withdrawn that statement. This pattern made every new admission difficult to evaluate. The question was not simply whether Hall had said something. The question was whether what he said corresponded to reality. Another case involved Eulalia "Lolly" Chavez. Chavez was 26 years old when her body was discovered in Illinois in 1986. The death involved signs of strangulation. Hall later wrote a letter claiming that he was connected to Chavez's death, which caused investigators to consider him as a suspect. But subsequent DNA testing did not provide sufficient evidence linking Hall to the crime scene. This case demonstrates why the expanding list of possible victims must be handled carefully. Hall could appear in a case through a confession, a letter, a suspected connection, or his presence in the region. Yet those circumstances did not necessarily survive scientific examination. In Chavez's case, the later DNA evidence failed to provide the connection investigators would have needed to establish Hall's involvement. These cases formed only part of the much larger group of women and girls whose names appeared in investigations involving Hall. The list included Deborah Jean Cole, Jennifer Lee Schmidt, Marcy Fuller Swinford, Denise Flum, Kimberly Ann Thompson, Diana Brongard, Paulette Webster, Cynthia Carmack, Penny Lease, Lynn Thompson, Tracy Crow, Janet Dalgy, Barrett Beck, Julie Dalton Johnson, Michelle Dewey, Georgia Shreve, and Holly and Anderson. Some were missing. Some were found dead. Some had circumstances that caused investigators to consider Hall. But the available information does not establish that all, or even most, were victims of Larry Hall. This distinction matters because the phrase Larry Hall's victims can easily turn suspicion into supposed fact. A long list of names can create the impression that every case has been solved, when the actual investigative record is much more uncertain. The responsible way to describe these women is as possible or suspected victims whose cases were examined in relation to Hall. That wording may sound cautious, but the caution is necessary. For families whose loved ones disappeared, an allegation that a particular person was responsible is not the same thing as an answer. The absence of a body, a lack of forensic evidence, or an unreliable confession can leave a family without the certainty they have spent years seeking. Hall's Civil War reenactment activities added another dimension to the investigation. He traveled extensively throughout the Midwest to participate in reenactments, giving him legitimate reasons to appear in communities far from his home. Investigators later noticed that some disappearances occurred in places and periods when Hall was known to travel for these activities. That pattern was significant enough to attract attention, but it was not itself proof of murder. The reenactments created mobility, not guilt. Yet the ability to travel widely was important because the cases under examination were scattered across states including Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Iowa, Michigan, and surrounding areas. In the 1980s and 1990s, investigators did not have the modern technological ability to reconstruct a person's movements with the precision that might be possible today. There were no comprehensive phone location records, no modern network of surveillance cameras, and no universal database capable of instantly connecting every piece of biological evidence from separate investigations. A person could travel hundreds of miles and leave behind little information about exactly where they had been. Hall's reenactment activities, therefore, made the geographical scope of the investigation especially difficult, but they also reinforced the need for caution. Being able to travel to many places meant Hall could potentially have been present in many places. It did not mean he committed crimes in all of them. The same problem applied to his van. Reports from young women had helped investigators identify Hall, and the vehicle became an important part of the investigation into Jessica. But a van was not a fingerprint. A suspicious vehicle could generate a lead without providing proof. Investigators had to determine whether Hall's movements, statements, and physical evidence could be connected to individual cases. In some instances, that connection remained incomplete. The growing number of possible cases nevertheless raised an unsettling question. What if Jessica Roach was not the only young woman whose disappearance was connected to Hall? That question could not be answered by statistics or by compiling names. It required evidence case by case, and Hall's own behavior made the task even more complicated. His alleged confessions created the appearance of knowledge, but his repeated retractions created doubt. If he was responsible for additional crimes, his willingness to confess and then withdraw his statements could have made those crimes extraordinarily difficult to prosecute. If he was not responsible for some of the cases, his confessions could have diverted investigators and created false leads. Either possibility was serious. This was the paradox that surrounded Hall as investigators continued looking into his history. The more cases in which his name appeared, the greater the suspicion became. But the greater the suspicion became, the more important it was to separate confirmed evidence from speculation. By the late 1990s, Hall was already in prison for life. Yet investigators believed he might still hold information about disappearances that had never been solved. The question was how to make him reveal that information in a form that could be tested. That was why James Keene became so important. The prison operation was not simply an attempt to hear Hall tell more stories. It was an attempt to discover whether those stories could lead investigators to something concrete. Somewhere beneath the layers of confessions, retractions, dreams, maps, suspected movements, and unanswered disappearances might have been the truth about other missing people. The challenge was finding it. By the time James "Jimmy" Keene began speaking with Larry Hall in prison, the investigation had entered a territory where ordinary rules of evidence became difficult to apply. Hall was already serving a life sentence for kidnapping Jessica Roach. Yet investigators continued to suspect that he might possess information about other missing women. The possibility was disturbing, but the problem was obvious. Hall had already demonstrated that his statements could not simply be accepted at face value. He had confessed in the Jessica case and later said that his account had been a dream. He had reportedly confessed to involvement in other disappearances and then withdrawn those statements as well. If Keene could persuade him to talk about additional crimes, investigators would have to determine whether those conversations represented genuine admissions, deliberate deception, psychological fantasy, or some combination of all three. The prison operation, therefore, became a test of Hall's credibility. According to the supplied information, Keene's task was to approach Hall as another inmate, establish a relationship, and encourage him to discuss crimes he might have committed. The ultimate objective was not simply to hear Hall say that he had killed someone. Investigators needed information that could be independently verified. If Hall identified a victim and then described a burial location, investigators could search that location. If he provided information about a crime scene that had never been made public, investigators could compare his account with the known facts. A statement could be challenged or retracted. Physical evidence was harder to dismiss. As Keene's relationship with Hall developed, Hall began talking about women and alleged killings. But his stories did not produce an immediate resolution. Instead, they created another layer of uncertainty. Hall could speak with apparent confidence and detail, but he could also change his account. He could describe something and later deny that it had actually happened. He could claim that what he had said came from a dream. For Keene, the challenge was therefore not merely to get Hall talking. It was to listen for information that could be tested. One of the most memorable details associated with Keene's account was a map. Keene reported seeing Hall with a map covering parts of the Midwest, including Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin, marked with numerous red dots. The image was striking because the surrounding investigation already involved a large number of unresolved disappearances. If the red dots represented burial sites, the map could potentially be a record of victims. But that interpretation was never established as fact. The map became one of the most intriguing elements of the Hall story. Yet its actual meaning remained uncertain. There was no confirmed official conclusion that every red mark represented a grave. The significance came primarily from Keene's account and the context in which he saw it. That distinction is crucial. A map with red dots can look like a physical representation of crimes, but without independent evidence connecting each location to a victim, it cannot be treated as a confirmed list of murder sites. Hall also made wooden hawks, and according to Keene, when he asked what the birds represented, Hall said that they were watching over the dead. The statement was unsettling because of its apparent connection to the conversations about missing women. But again, the interpretation remained uncertain. The hawks could be understood in the context of Hall's personal behavior and the stories he told, but the supplied information does not establish that they were markers for actual graves. The danger in the Hall case was that individual details could appear to reinforce one another even when their factual meaning remained unknown. A red dot on a map could become a suspected grave, A wooden bird could become a symbol of a victim. A confession could become an admission to murder. A travel record could become evidence of an abduction. But suspicion is not the same as proof. And Hall's history made that distinction especially important. The investigation had to resist the temptation to turn every disturbing detail into confirmation of a larger theory. This was particularly true because Hall had already been connected, at least as a suspect, to numerous missing person cases. If investigators approached the map with a predetermined belief that Hall had killed dozens of women, they could potentially interpret ambiguous information as confirmation. The more reliable approach was the opposite. Each statement had to be tested independently. Keene's conversations with Hall, therefore, became a strange process of separating information from performance. Hall appeared to understand that his stories had power. A confession could make another person listen. A disturbing detail could create fear or fascination. A claim about an unknown victim could make investigators search for answers. Whether Hall consciously used that power in every conversation cannot be established from the supplied information. But the possibility was one of the reasons his statements were treated cautiously. His pattern of confession and retraction had already demonstrated that his words could not be considered automatically reliable. This was also why the idea of a serial confessor became relevant to the Hall investigation. The term captures the central paradox of his case. Hall appeared capable of confessing to crimes, but the existence of a confession did not necessarily prove that the crime had occurred as he described it, or that he had committed it. In Jessica's case, the legal system ultimately convicted him of kidnapping despite the controversy surrounding his confession. In other cases, however, his statements did not lead to prosecution. Some involved missing women whose bodies were never recovered. Others involved physical evidence that failed to connect Hall to the crime. The case of Eulalia Lali Chavez illustrates this problem. Hall reportedly wrote a letter claiming involvement in Chavez's death, and investigators considered him a suspect. But later DNA testing did not provide sufficient evidence linking him to the crime scene. The statement alone could not close the case. The same problem surrounded other alleged confessions. A statement could raise suspicion, but unless it could be independently supported, investigators remained unable to convert it into a criminal conviction. The map therefore occupied an unusual position. It was potentially significant because it came from a man suspected of multiple disappearances and because it appeared, according to Keene's account, to contain numerous marked locations. But without independent confirmation, its meaning remained unresolved. This uncertainty extended to the number of possible victims associated with Hall. Various accounts and investigative materials have connected him to many missing women and girls, but the number of victims cannot simply be presented as an established total. Some people on those lists were missing, some were found dead. Some cases involved Hall as a suspect. Some involved alleged confessions. Yet Hall was not convicted of all those crimes. In fact, the supplied information makes clear that he was never convicted of murder. His established conviction concerned the kidnapping of Jessica Roach. That legal boundary must remain visible even when discussing the more disturbing allegations. The red dot map, if it existed as described, could not erase that distinction. Nor could Hall's conversations with Keene. They could generate investigative leads, but leads still required verification. The same principle applied to the locations where Hall had traveled. His Civil War reenactment activities gave him legitimate reasons to move throughout the Midwest. Investigators had noticed that some disappearances occurred in areas where Hall may have been present. But his ability to travel did not prove that he committed crimes in those places. It simply meant that investigators had to consider the possibility. The Midwest itself became almost a second character in the investigation, not because the landscape proved anything, but because the geographic spread of the cases made the investigation so difficult. Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Iowa, Michigan, and surrounding areas contained communities where young women disappeared, sometimes leaving little evidence behind. Hall's movements provided a possible thread connecting some of those places, but the thread was never strong enough to establish a single narrative for every case. What investigators needed was something more concrete: a body, a forensic match, a piece of evidence tied directly to Hall, a location that could be searched and independently confirmed, a detail about a crime that Hall could know only because he had been involved. Without such evidence, the map remained a mystery and the conversations remained allegations. Yet the very possibility that Hall knew the location of victims was too important to ignore. For families whose daughters, sisters, and loved ones had vanished, even an uncertain lead could represent the possibility of an answer. That was why investigators continued listening, and that was why Keene's role remained so important. He was positioned close enough to Hall to hear what the imprisoned man might reveal. But he also had to recognize that every revelation could be a mixture of truth and invention. The investigation had moved beyond the question of whether Hall could confess. He had already shown that he could. The real question was whether he could provide information that reality would confirm. Somewhere between Hall's stories and the physical world was the evidence investigators needed. The map might have pointed toward that evidence. The red dots might have meant something. The wooden hawks might have had a private significance. Or all of those details might have been part of Hall's psychological world rather than a record of real murders. At that stage, no responsible conclusion could be drawn. The only certainty was that the search for truth had become inseparable from the problem of determining when Larry Hall was telling the truth. And that question would remain at the center of every investigation connected to his name. Jimmy Keene, the search for verification, and the unanswered dead, the investigation surrounding Larry Hall, had reached a point where the central problem was no longer simply identifying a suspect. Hall was already imprisoned for life. The conviction involving Jessica Roach had survived a retrial and appellate review. Yet investigators continued to believe that Hall might possess information about other disappearances and killings across the Midwest. The difficulty was that Hall's words had never been easy to interpret. He had confessed to Jessica's kidnapping and death, then said that his account was only a dream. He had reportedly confessed to involvement in other cases, only to withdraw those statements later. His stories could be detailed, disturbing, and apparently confident, but they did not always produce evidence that could be independently confirmed. That was why James Jimmy Keene became so important. In 1998, Keene was serving a 10-year sentence for drug-related offenses when federal prosecutors approached him with a proposition. He would move to the federal facility in Springfield, Missouri, where Hall was being held, and he would attempt to establish a relationship with him. His purpose was to make Hall talk, but the real objective went beyond obtaining another confession. Investigators wanted information that could be verified. If Hall claimed responsibility for another disappearance, they needed him to provide details that could be compared with known facts. If he described a burial site, investigators wanted to locate the remains. If he revealed something about a crime that had never been made public, that information might offer a way to distinguish truth from invention. In other words, the investigators were searching for something that Hall's previous confessions had failed to provide: independent confirmation. Keene therefore entered into a relationship with Hall under false pretenses. Hall believed he was dealing with another prisoner rather than someone attempting to gather information for investigators. That deception was essential to the operation. A formal interrogation had already produced a confession in Jessica's case, but the legal controversy surrounding that confession had demonstrated the difficulty of relying on words alone. Keene's approach was different. He would not sit across from Hall as an FBI agent demanding answers. Instead, he would become someone Hall might voluntarily talk to. According to the supplied information, Keene gradually developed a relationship with Hall, and Hall began discussing women and alleged killings. The conversations produced claims involving multiple cases, but they also revealed the same problem that had followed Hall for years. Hall could say one thing and later say something different. He could appear to describe an actual crime and then suggest that the story had been a dream. He could change locations or details. His statements, therefore, had to be treated as leads rather than automatic proof. This was especially important because some of the women whose names had become associated with Hall had never been found. A confession without a body created a difficult evidentiary situation. If the victim remained missing, investigators might have no physical evidence against which to test Hall's story. The absence of a body also meant that investigators could not necessarily determine how the person had died or whether a homicide had occurred at all. This was one reason the search for burial locations became so important. A physical discovery could transform an otherwise unverifiable statement into something much more significant. One of the most memorable elements of Keene's account was the map marked with red dots. Keene reported seeing Hall with a map covering parts of the Midwest, including Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. The map contained numerous red marks. Keene suspected that the marks represented locations connected to victims or burial sites. Hall also made wooden hawks. When Keene asked what they meant, Hall reportedly said that they were watching over the dead. The details were disturbing, but they could not automatically be interpreted as a literal record of murders. The supplied information does not establish that the red dots were officially confirmed graves, nor that every location on the map corresponded to a missing person. The map, therefore, remains one of the great unresolved elements of the Hall story. It could have represented something important. It could have reflected Hall's own psychological world. It could have contained genuine locations mixed with invented ones. Without independent confirmation, there was no reliable way to know. That uncertainty is at the heart of the Hall investigation. A serial killer who lies can make investigations difficult. A person who confesses falsely can make them difficult in an entirely different way. Hall's behavior left investigators confronting both possibilities. If he was responsible for numerous killings, then some of his statements could have contained genuine information about victims whose cases remained unsolved. But if he was a serial confessor who created stories, then investigators risked being led away from the truth every time they accepted an unverified claim. This is why the distinction between confirmed victims and possible victims is so important. Names such as Tricia Reitler, Linda Weldy, Wendy Felton, Lori DePies, Eulalia Lolly Chavez, and many others have appeared in discussions of Hall's possible activities. Yet Hall was not convicted of killing these women. In some cases, he was considered a suspect. In some, he reportedly confessed. In others, there were circumstances that attracted investigative attention. But suspicion is not the same as proof. The case of Eulalia Chavez provides a particularly important example because Hall reportedly wrote a letter claiming involvement in her death. But later DNA testing did not provide sufficient evidence connecting him to the crime scene. The confession, therefore, did not settle the case. It became another piece of information that investigators had to evaluate against physical evidence. The same principle applied to Tricia Reitler. Hall's name had become significant in the investigation, and material in his vehicle reportedly included items associated with the case. He also reportedly confessed and later withdrew the confession. But Tricia's body was never found, and Hall was never prosecuted for her disappearance. Her family was therefore left with an unresolved case rather than a courtroom determination of what had happened. For the families of missing women, this distinction could be painful. A person might be suspected for years, and investigators might believe they had found a possible connection. Yet without sufficient evidence, there could be no final legal answer. The Hall investigation illustrates how difficult it can be to move from suspicion to certainty when a case lacks a body, reliable witnesses, or physical evidence. Hall's ability to travel throughout the Midwest made the problem even more complicated. His participation in Civil War reenactments gave him legitimate reasons to travel far from his home. In Indiana, investigators noticed that some disappearances occurred in places where Hall had been or might have been present because of these activities. But again, travel was not proof of a crime. It was a circumstance that required investigation. The geography of the cases created an enormous investigative challenge because the disappearances were spread across multiple states. A single person could potentially appear in several jurisdictions without immediately attracting attention, particularly during the 1980s and 1990s, when investigators lacked many of the technologies that would later become standard. There were no widespread mobile phone location records, no comprehensive GPS history, and no dense network of surveillance cameras capable of reconstructing a person's movements. Investigators had to work with the evidence that survived. Hall's vehicle, witness reports, travel information, personal statements, and physical evidence could each provide a piece of a puzzle. But the pieces did not always form a complete picture. The prison operation with Keene was an attempt to overcome that limitation by using Hall himself as a source of information. But even here, the same problem remained. Hall could talk, but could he be trusted? That question had no simple answer. His conviction in the Jessica Roach case established that the evidence presented at trial was sufficient to prove kidnapping beyond the required legal standard. His life sentence remained in place after the retrial and subsequent appellate review. But that conviction did not answer the broader allegations surrounding him. It did not establish that he was responsible for every disappearance investigators had examined. It did not turn his alleged confessions into automatic proof of murder. And it did not reveal the full meaning of the red dot map described by Keene. The result was a case divided into different levels of certainty. At the center was Jessica Roach, whose kidnapping had been established in court. Around that established conviction was a much larger circle of unresolved cases, suspicious circumstances, alleged confessions, and investigative theories. Beyond that was an even wider field of disappearances for which Hall's involvement remained unknown. This layered structure is what makes Hall's story so difficult to summarize accurately. Calling him a serial killer responsible for dozens of deaths presents suspicion as fact. Calling him merely a kidnapper convicted in one case ignores the extensive investigation into his possible involvement in other disappearances. The truth lies in the distinction between what has been proven and what remains unresolved. Hall's story eventually reached a much wider audience through James Keene's memoir In With the Devil and the later Apple TV Plus miniseries Blackbird, which was inspired by the events surrounding Keene's attempt to obtain information from Hall. The adaptation brought renewed attention to the unusual prison operation and to the question of whether Hall was responsible for more deaths than the legal record could establish. But even when the story entered popular culture, the fundamental uncertainty remained. The purpose of Keene's mission had never been simply to create a dramatic confession. It was to discover whether Hall possessed information that could lead investigators to physical evidence and, ultimately, to answers for families whose loved ones had disappeared. That objective captures the essence of the entire case. Words were not enough. Hall had already provided words, sometimes as confessions, sometimes as retractions, sometimes as stories that he later described differently. What investigators needed was something beyond speech. They needed a location, a body, forensic evidence, or another independent fact capable of confirming what Hall claimed. Without that confirmation, the larger allegations could never be transformed into established crimes. And that is where the story of Larry Hall remains today, not as a neatly completed list of victims, but as a complicated record containing one major conviction, numerous investigative suspicions, disputed confessions, and questions that have never been fully answered. How many people did Hall actually harm? Which of the cases associated with him were genuine connections, and which were false leads? Did the red dots on his map correspond to real burial sites? Or did they mean something else entirely? Did Hall know the locations of missing victims because he had been responsible for their deaths? Or because he wanted others to believe that he was? The available information does not provide definitive answers to those questions. What it does provide is a portrait of an investigation in which certainty was always difficult to obtain. For the victims and their families, that uncertainty is not an abstract mystery. Each unresolved name represents a person whose life mattered and whose disappearance left people waiting for answers. That is the most important perspective from which to view the Larry Hall case. The enduring mystery is not simply how many crimes might be connected to one imprisoned man. It is how many families may still be living without knowing exactly what happened to someone they loved.